Good morning. It's Friday, April 24th. We're continuing our series in World War II. So let's pick back up where we were leaving off, and that was discussing the Italian theater. So in 1943, the Allies had invaded Italy. They started by coming through Sicily. Sicily is the island right off the coast of southern Italy, and then they made their way to the mainland. Italy had been falling to the Allied advance in 1943. So it starts in the far south, and slowly and surely the Allies continue up the north route through Italy. Now, this is an important theater of action. Number one is it does give the Allies possession of Italy, but also it prepares them for what is to come later. There was a lot of things that were being tested: tactics, equipment, weapons, but also people. And the supreme commander for the Allies of the Italian invasion had been General Mark Clark. Now, after bogging down for a couple months, the progress resumes. Rome had fallen to the Allies in early June of 1943, but it shouldn't have. So General Mark Clark had a decision. Remember, Italy is a rather long, narrow nation, and there was an opportunity for the Allies to essentially cut in. And had they cut in, they would have surrounded the German army, and they would have captured and destroyed a large chunk of the German army. It would have been a major victory, and it would help the Allies not only in Italy, but also later in the war. General Mark Clark made a decision. He made a decision that went against the commands of his superior, which was Dwight Eisenhower. He entered Rome rather than cutting off the retreating army. So what did this do? Well, it allowed tens of thousands of German troops to be able to get farther north before they could be surrounded, and therefore they would be able to fight again later on in the war. But it did allow General Mark Clark the glory of entering Rome and appearing to be the savior of Rome. And at this point, remember, for Italy in 43 was pretending as if they were looking forward to liberation by the Americans. And so Mark Clark was greeted with roses and cheers and kisses. It was what he wanted, and it was a major, major strategic failure on his part. He was despised by his soldiers. His soldiers could recognize what he had done. In fact, later on, there was a soldier by the name of Audie Murphy. Audie Murphy is the most decorated soldier in U.S. military history, a tremendously brave and capable young man. He won the Congressional Medal of Honor and survived. Now, there is a rule within military justice, or within military code, that the lower officer or the lower person in rank always salutes the superior first. Now, the exception is for those who win the Medal of Honor. Everyone salutes those who win the Medal of Honor. And so when Audie Murphy was brought to Mark Clark, he did not salute Mark Clark. In fact, he stood there until General Mark Clark, realized what was going on, and General Mark Clark had to salute Audie Murphy. It was a very subtle but very pointed way in which Audie Murphy showed his displeasure, his dislike of General Mark Clark and what he had done and how he had cost the Allies in soldiers. So what happens was eventually Mark Clark was removed from command. We mentioned that yesterday, and better men would take his place. Now, by this time in 1943, Italy had been reduced to a minor partner to Germany because of its just general incompetence and weakness. Early in the war, Mussolini tried to position himself as a counterpart and equal to Hitler, but Hitler had the German army. The German army won battle after battle after battle. The Italian army lost battle after battle after battle. And in several places, like North Africa, the Germans had to come and, well, defend the Italians because they were unable to do so for themselves. That's a major issue. So Italy had been reduced to a minor partner because of its incompetence and weakness. Mussolini, by this time, was being treated with contempt by the Germans. He would talk about what he wanted to do and what he thought was fair, and the Germans, frankly, ignored him because why bother? He had been powerless. He was unable to deliver on the promises that he had made and unable to do much of anything. So Mussolini was being treated by contempt. Back in 1943, the king declared Mussolini was no longer in power. Now, that's a little bit of a farce because the king was the one who had put Mussolini in power. Now, Mussolini kept governing. Why? Because the German army was in Italy, and they said Mussolini was in power. So as the Germans lost ground, however, that meant that no longer would Mussolini be able to be supported. He eventually was put into a fortress for his own protection. Eventually, he was captured by the Italians before he could escape to Spain, and Mussolini was killed by the suddenly brave Italian partisans. So what happened is Mussolini falls into the hands of the Italians, and what do the Italians do? They want to show how good and powerful and brave they are. They kill a broken and weak man. Now, he was an evil man. He deserved to die, don't get me wrong. But the Italians acting like that they had done this. They had done nothing. But Mussolini dies in 45, well before the end of the war. But really, he had lost power by end of 1943. So that was the Italian front. By the end of 1943, the Allies were racing up North Italy. Now, on the Eastern Front, after lifting the sieges of several key cities, including Stalingrad, the Soviets went on the offensive. No longer were they going to be attacked by the Germans, rather they were going to attack the Germans. The Battle of Kursk in 1943 is the largest tank battle in history. Kursk was designed for tanks. It was almost like a video game in the way that it's wide and flat and thousands of vehicles went after each other. Now, technically speaking, the Battle of Kursk ended in a draw, but the Soviets were in an excellent position to continue their offensive after the battle. Starting in the summer of 1944, the Soviet Union began a series of offensives that continued almost unbroken until the end of the war. Zhukov, the commander of the Soviets, kept pressure constant and seized available advantages. So essentially, the Eastern Front was just a long, steady march of the Soviets moving into German-held territory and possessing it. Bit by bit, they were tightening the noose around the Germans. In the Pacific, 1943, American submarine warfare had ground the Japanese economy to a halt. Most time when we discuss submarines in World War II, we usually talk about German submarines in the Atlantic. We mentioned how by 43 and into 44 and 45, the Allies had turned the Atlantic around, and they were sinking German submarines more frequently than German submarines were able to sink ships. That was not the case in the Pacific. In the Pacific, the Americans had discovered that there was a very particular kind of man who was fit to be a submarine commander, somebody who was daring and bold and a good judge and aggressive above all things. And the Americans very quickly got better quality submarines, but more importantly, better quality submarine commanders. And the American submarines in the Pacific annihilated Japanese shipping. Fascinating book. If you ever want to read it, it's called Thunder Below. It is the story of Commander, I believe, Eugene Fluckey, a submarine commander in World War II. It is almost unbelievable, but this is what happened. Just the exploits, their work as they continued to hound and destroy the Japanese. So remember, when the Japanese expanded their empire, it was necessary for them to capture places that had raw materials, because they had very little metal, very little fuel, very little rubber, ammo, food, everything else. It all had to be shipped in. But they couldn't ship it in if their ships kept sinking, and that's what the Japanese or the American submarines kept doing. So this also led to an island hopping campaign. The Americans determined that as they began to shrink the Japanese empire, they would not attack every base. So if you can imagine, there were a number of islands scattered throughout the Pacific. Let's just say here's an island, here's an island, here's an island, and here's an island. Let's say this island right here has a massive naval base on it, or a massive army base. What the Allies would do is they would take this island right here. This island they could use as a staging ground. So then they could sail here and capture this island. This island was now American. But rather than move on to the next one, this massive base, what the Americans would do was bypass or hop, island hop. And the next thing they would do would be to capture this island. And the result being is that this island was now surrounded, and the American submarines would deny any supplies. And so for the rest of the war, all of the men, all of the material, and everything else that is on that island was stuck. It never went anywhere. There was nothing to do. And gradually the United States sent their bombers and just beat them into submission. That was the island hopping campaign. To give you an idea, this is of the American submarines and their effectiveness. Not only did they go after Japanese merchant ships, they also went after Japanese warfighting vessels. This is a Japanese, it looks like a heavy cruiser. You can see right here These are the forward turret, the guns, and this is sinking. That's the Japanese flag on the top. And this is a bad place for a ship to be. What you're looking at is the periscope view of a sunken or a sinking ship that the American submarine has just torpedoed. The Marines, the United States Marines, fought a brutal but victorious series of battles on the islands of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and a number of other islands. These gave the U.S. new airfields closer and closer to Japan and robbed Japan of naval bases. In the process, the American Marines, sometimes the Army as well, although much of the Army fighting was done in Europe, destroyed the Japanese Army. The Japanese military could not deal with the losses, whereas the Americans could, because the American economy was in overdrive at this point, and it was churning out material at a speed that nobody had ever anticipated. The rest of the island bases were starved and bombarded into submission. These right here is a picture of Marines as they're walking on the island of Guadalcanal. They're traversing one of the rivers. The fighting in the Pacific was particularly bloody for a number of reasons. Number one, the Japanese had told all their troops that the Americans would torture them if they were captured. So the result was Japanese soldiers fought to the death. They fought fanatically. Number two is the Japanese soldiers at first believed the Americans were cowards. And so they frequently launched what were called banzai charges, in which they would run with either bayonets fixed or swords drawn, and they would try to engage the American Marines in hand-to-hand combat. Now, by the end of Guadalcanal and the other fighting, they began to think the Americans were actually demons, because the Americans, not only were they not afraid of hand-to-hand combat, they were very good at hand-to-hand combat. The stories from Guadalcanal and from other places of Edson's Raiders and Merrill's Marauders, these were units on Guadalcanal, of Chesty Puller, one of the most highly decorated U.S. Marines who as colonel led his troops in Guadalcanal, and their willingness to fight the enemy at close quarters and defeat the enemy and beat them down and to continue to take bombardment time and time again became the stuff of legend. And the Japanese were convinced by the end of these battles that the Americans were not fearful of them. In fact, they were looking for it. And so these were bloody battles, difficult battles, but they were successful battles. And bit by bit, the Americans won. Just a brief story to give you the appreciation, is the very first Japanese force that hit the Americans after they landed on Guadalcanal was actually a very undersized force, I believe led by a Colonel Ito. And he led his 800 men to essentially attack, I believe, 12,000 Marines, convinced that the Marines would run. They were annihilated. No one existed. And in fact, over the next months, thousands of more Japanese troops were landed on Guadalcanal. And just like all the ones who had gone before them, they took their beating at the hands of the U.S. Marines. They were defeated and they were sent back. In early 1944, the Americans targeted the massive Japanese naval base at Truk, also called Chuk. Many ships were sunk, many aircraft were destroyed. The Japanese, by this time, the Japanese fleet, what was left of it, could not even venture beyond really the homeland. Any time a Japanese ship sailed away from Japan, it was like walking into the midst of a hunting field. They were just being destroyed one by one, or sometimes in groups. In the meantime, the American fleet in the Pacific, which took different names depending on the commander, was the largest fleet in the world. It wasn't just the largest fleet in the world. It was the most powerful fleet in human history, and it was probably stronger than every other navy in the world put together, just the American Pacific Fleet. This was a picture of the Pacific Fleet taken by one of the planes. It does not contain all of the ships, but right here, right off the bat, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 fleet carriers, 2 more auxiliary carriers, a number of battleships, and this is only part of it. This view right here would annihilate almost every other navy in the world, well, every other navy in the world at the time, and once you put this entire fleet together, it would take on the entire world. And so naturally, when the Japanese sailed out, they sailed to their deaths, because Admiral Bull Halsey, Admiral Spruance, and Fletcher, and Mark Mitcher, and many of these other American commanders, all led by Chester Nimitz, they were looking to destroy. They were looking to hunt them down. The United States ruled both the ocean and the air, and anywhere else they wanted. Late in 1943, the Big Three. The Big Three refers to the leaders of the Allies: Winston Churchill of Great Britain, Franklin Roosevelt of the United States of America, and Joseph Stalin of Soviet Union. They met together at Tehran, Iran, to discuss the war and what the world would look like after the war. It was one of a number of these high-level conferences. For the last 2 years, the Soviets had been pushing the Allies to open up a second front to take some of the pressure away. They had been receiving all of their supplies from the Allies. Now, Stalin really wanted this second front. Now, the Americans agreed. They'd been wanting to do this for a while, and so they targeted 1944 as the year. That was going to be the year the Americans and the British and the rest of the Allies would invade North France and would open up a Western front with which to attack Germany. The supreme commander of the Allied forces was General Dwight Eisenhower. He's one of the greatest strategic generals of all time, and by that I mean his ability to see the big picture, to move the pieces across the board, and to keep focus on the end game. He was a man of great character and great will. He was respected and obeyed by all. He had the courage not only to implement his plans, but also to listen to subordinates when they had good plans, and also to get rid of those who were unable to do the job. And there's a special kind of courage to do that, because sometimes it included friends. For years, the Allies had been preparing. The task was going to require the greatest amphibious force in history. For 2 years, Eisenhower's staff had been working on the problem. The Germans had also been preparing. They'd turned the north of France into what was called Fortress Europa. The beaches were lined with mines and barbed wire and traps for ships and machine gun nests and artillery. It was going to be death for whoever invaded. The Allies worked hard to deceive the Germans. In fact, in 1944, in early summer, they had successfully tricked the Germans into thinking that the invasion would come at a place in France called Calais. However, the intended target was another series of beaches called Normandy. The area of Normandy was divided into 5 particular beaches, and multiple armies would attempt to land in the midst of machine gun fire, artillery, and other weapons. After days of bad weather, General Dwight Eisenhower gave the command. So June 6, 1944 would become D-Day, the day of the invasion. This gives you, once again, a small view of what the invasion force looked like. It was a massive assemblage of ships and men. Operation Overlord, that was the name given to the Normandy landings, has been called the greatest masterpiece of organization in human history. It's unlikely that anything has ever required, except maybe the moon landing or something along those lines, required this much sustained effort by so many people. Close to 160,000 men landed or parachuted in a single day. They met heavy resistance. Men died in the water. Men died on the sands. Men died everywhere. It was won by blood and by courage. The men kept fighting until they breached the walls and established a beachhead, which was a tremendous testament to the courage and the bravery, the skill and the power of the American, Canadian, British, New Zealand, Australian, South African, Indian, every nation that participated. It's just a testament to their soldiers. Parachutists were working behind the lines to destroy the Germans as well. 101st Airborne gained immortal glory through their work during D-Day. Hitler refused to commit the reserves. As soon as it became obvious that this was a major invasion, he was still convinced of the Allied hoax. In fact, the Germans were also convinced, by the way, that General George Patton would lead the assault, and he had set up his headquarters right across the beach, right across the water, the English Channel, from Calais. So Hitler refused to commit the reserves to drive the Allies into the sea because he thought the real punch was going to come at Calais. It was a brilliant bit of deception. In the meantime, while Hitler stalled, more men, more equipment poured ashore. The Allies were pushing hard and were gaining ground in France. By August of 1944, the Americans had established enough of a beachhead and brought enough materials inland. They were ready to go on the offensive. General Omar Bradley held the crucial center group. He was high in command, and at this point, he had a general under him, a general he knew well, General George Patton. And so Bradley gave Patton the green light to take his tanks and to go south. And Patton's group was called the Big Red One. That was the nickname given to them. This is the view of D-Day. When this ship, this is a landing vessel, it's small, it goes up to the shore, and this front end, the entire front falls forward, almost like a ramp, and these men will then run off. Now, as soon as this thing falls forward, however, what usually happens is the machine gun fire pours in. And it was not uncommon for the men in the front to be shot down while the men in the back had to run over their bodies or sometimes even jump over the edges and try to make their way. I've been to Normandy. The sand here is 100 yards wide, and these hills allow for perfect views for shooting and for shelling. It was a brutal killing field, but these men did it. Patton, now with the big red one, begins racing south after the Germans. Other than Rommel, Patton most understood how tanks could be used, and he employed them the best. He drove his men hard, and they respected him. His forces sped south through France and trampled the Germans faster than they could retreat. You remember at the beginning of the war, Rommel violated orders, and he pursued the French so hard that he never let them set up a defensive. Well, Patton did the same thing. He pursued the Germans so hard they could never set up a defensive. He was freeing France in large chunks. He was just eating the ground up as Patton and his tanks raced through. By the end of August, he had to stop. And it was never because the Germans stopped him. It's because he was given no more gasoline. His tanks literally were running out of gas. Instead, General Eisenhower made a decision. The British had been pushing hard, you can almost say maybe complaining hard, that they wanted to launch their own operation. It was called Operation Market Garden. And, well, Eisenhower made a decision. There was not enough fuel and ammo to support two main offensives, both Patton's and Bernard Montgomery's Operation Market Garden. He made the decision to cut off Patton and go with Market Garden. So in the days ahead, we'll see what happens there.